The Columbian Exchange for other parts of the world was arguably beneficial, maybe a slightly loaded word, but beneficial may do. That is, American food products began to spread widely to other areas and enhanced food supplies in ways that would help sustain and even augment populations. China, for example, by the early 17th century, was utilizing American crops like sweet potatoes and corn, along with some new strains of rice in China itself, and this served as a basis for considerable population expansion later in the 17th and in the 18th centuries. China gained these crops mainly through their ongoing contact with the Philippines, where Spaniards had introduced American crops to see if they would also help improve the food supply there. The pattern obviously shows the continued complexity of China's relationship with the wider world and the capacity for real innovation. India also adopted some New World crops, and again, there were probably population consequences there as well. Europe, ironically, was slower to introduce New World crops. Europeans were very food conservative, arguing that these new crops were not mentioned in the Bible and therefore might be the source of evil and disease. But by the late 17th century, Europeans as well were beginning to use the potato. They used corn less, which remained mainly a food for animals, and on this basis would experience a dramatic population increase as well. The Columbian Exchange for the world as a whole served to augment the food basis for population growth, but in particular societies, particularly the Americas themselves, served as a population deterrent for a considerable period of time. The African involvement in the Columbian Exchange was obviously complicated. New World foods, particularly corn, spread widely to Africa and helped sustain population development. But here, there was another biological exchange in people themselves that worked in the other direction. Beginning in the 16th century, 8 to 12 million Africans would be seized in the Atlantic slave trade, taken to the Americas, often in hideous conditions, a level of displacement that had obvious population consequences for Africa, particularly West Africa, as a disproportionate number of the slaves were males and young, prime age for reproduction. So overall, in the early modern period, when these two forces are put together, African populations roughly stabilized, suffering in some regions, benefiting slightly in others. The most vigorous impact of the Columbian Exchange had ended by the early 18th century. Disease patterns began to stabilize in the Americas as more people became disease resistant and as the bulk of the population now mixed European and Native American heritage in the mestizo group that would quickly become a majority. So the Columbian Exchange is not an eternal pattern in world history, but it did organize some very significant developments during much of the early modern period, some of which, including China's population growth, would continue to ramify thereafter. Third basic feature of the early modern period, the extent to which gunpowder was utilized to establish a new series of empires in a way that actually had never before been matched in world history. This was a great age of empire at two levels. First, familiar. The Europeans, launched by the Spanish and Portuguese, established their famous overseas empires in the Americas, in parts of Asia and Africa, as we've already discussed. So Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British, French empires become the great overseas empires of the early modern period with huge consequences in world history. But equally important, indeed for much of the early modern period, more important, was the establishment of land-based gunpowder empires in Asia. The Ottoman Turks, for example, had used gunpowder, had used cannon in their siege of Constantinople. The establishment of the Ottoman Empire was partly based on the use of land-based cannon and guns. The new Mughal Empire in India was similarly organized by invaders who utilized new weaponry. The Safavid Empire in Persia was another gunpowder empire. The expanded Russian Empire quickly became a fourth gunpowder empire. So In Eastern Europe and much of Asia, a new series of empires arose on the basis of new military technology, quite different in orientation from the more commercially minded European overseas empires, but equally important because they maintain sway over such a significant landmass and over such dynamic economies. And even in China, the last dynasty, which launched in the 17th century, the Qing dynasty, was itself partly a gunpowder empire operated by Manchurians, not Chinese proper, who used new weaponry as one of their means of obtaining new political control on the Chinese mainland. This establishment of empire, which goes way beyond the familiar story of the rise of the West, is a crucial development in the early modern period that deserves attention in its own right. A couple of things did not happen in world history in this period. The early modern period is not a distinct period with regard to gender relations, for example. The post-classical period, with the complicated impact of the world religions on gender relations, but also the pattern of increasing subservience of women in a number of key societies, such as China. Post-classical period suggests a break in gender relations, but in terms of the world as a whole, the early modern period did not. There were important developments. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas had huge implications for American gender relations because European values and expectations differed so greatly from Native American traditions. The slave trade, in withdrawing men from Africa, increased the importance of polygamy in Africa because of the need to provide family arrangements for the remaining women. Again, a significant gender change. So there are points of change in specific cases, but there's no blanket pattern that allows us to use the early modern period for purposes of gender discrimination. The same thing, interestingly, applies to culture. There are all sorts of cultural developments in the early modern period, and we will have to pay attention to them. The importation of European religion, artistic styles, and some science to the Americas was a huge change in American cultural history. European culture itself would change, and we'll be taking this up quite specifically with, for example, the rise of science, the division of European Christendom, etc. European cultural patterns would have some impact on a few other societies, particularly Russia, but in the world as a whole, in the early modern period, there is no overall cultural dynamic. It's as though, and I think in some cases this is really exactly the situation, it's as though individual societies like Japan, even as new opportunities for contact developed, decided, okay, we may indulge these to a degree. Perhaps China would be a better example here. We may indulge these new contacts to a degree, but not at the expense of massive cultural influence. The Chinese, for example, would tolerate a little bit of European missionary activity as long as the Europeans were respectful of Chinese ways and dressed like Confucian scholars, but they were not interested in more significant cultural interpenetration, and indeed they would later move to block missionary activity to a greater extent as well. This is not a period of vibrant cultural exchange on a global basis. This is not a period of systematic cultural innovation.